So the first thing that I did today was look at expanding the head hole for the seventh space sci-fi convention tunic, because when we tried them on the actors, the head hole was quite tight. I think this is because I made the pattern smaller to fit the actor, but I didn't take into account that I was also making the head hole smaller, and their heads were not smaller, so it needed to be bigger. To do this, I picked along the shoulder a little bit and then rolled the hem across, and I did this on both sides, so it matched. So it wasn't slipping off and being wider on one point and shorter on the other, because that would look odd. And I used the same zigzag stitch as I had with the rest of them. And once I'd done this, I hung it up. And then I started looking at creating a patch for when Michael is at the planetarium. So a patch that was pretty like a planetarium logo. So to help me do this, I looked at photos of different logos for planetariums. What I saw was a lot of planets, a lot of rockets and stars. There was quite a few observatories or telescopes, but I felt that in fabric that wouldn't translate as well. The shape would probably be, you wouldn't really realize what it was. You'd just be confused by it. So I went for a planet and a rocket because I felt that was more recognizable than maybe the telescope or the observatory um, images. So I started out drawing on paper my design for it, and then, much in the same way that I created the name patches, I traced over it to create layers. So I had one round piece for the actual planet, which I used a roll of tape to draw around to make sure I got a perfect circle. And I did a separate layer for the rings around the planet, and then separate layers for the rocket, so I could put them on top of each other to give them more structural integrity. And once I'd done that, I also cut pieces out of bundle web to put on them to make it not only stiffer but also easier to sew, because it will hold it together and also make it stiffer, which makes it easier to get through the machine. I did have some trouble sewing it together, as at points where, like on really small corners where there's only one layer of material underneath it, the machine will eat the fabric and it will try and suck it in. So you have to be really careful about where you start, because otherwise it will pull it in. So I try to start on larger areas and come past that, because it's mostly the actual starting that the machine struggles with, not so much once it's got going. So it's easier to get through the smaller corners, the smaller parts like that. And particularly with this one that I was doing, there was a lot of smaller corners, which I probably could have considered better, maybe made a larger, more blocky design with less detail, because I think that made it trickier to do. And once I'd done that, I put that to the side because I'm not entirely sure what item that I want to sew it onto yet, whether I'm going to put it on a shirt or on a jacket, which I need to decide soon. I then had the actors come down to try on their jackets, the jocks to try on their jackets. So that's Eddie, Huey, and Wayne, both casts. So I had them all try it on to make sure it fit both of them and both of their partners in the other cast, which it did. And I kept a record of which size went to whom and who had two different sizes between their two different casts, just so I could remember and doubly check that I put the right letters on the right jackets. I started off by putting Eddie's name on the back of the jacket because I felt this would be the most time consuming, because uh, Light Layers, it's the only one with a name on the back. And I was correct, it did take quite a while, particularly going around curves, like with both the E's and the bottom of the D's. It can be quite difficult, and I have to go very, very slowly with a very small stitch to try and get around it. And um, I used bonded web again to iron it on, for the same reason as I did with layers, as just because it's so intricate, it's much easier to do it like that. I didn't use bond web to iron on the H or the W or the E on the front of their jackets, um, because I just put a couple of pins in because they sat pretty well. And I tried it first with the E to see if I might need to put some bond web on it, but I did not. It was nice and flat, and it didn't shift around a lot when I was moving it. The hardest one was the W. I think this was because it was really the most intricate. It had a lot of turning round at the corners as the little squares or rectangles at the top. I had to be quite careful manipulating my fabric around. It was very difficult to fit it in the machine when I was twisting it because usually when sewing something on, I'll pick the side with the least fabric and that'll dictate which way round I start. So the most of the fabric stays on this open side rather than being stuffed in the side of the machine. But because it is twisted and turned around so much because they're such complicated shapes, you end up having to push all of the jacket through the side of the machine as you go around, and that made it a lot harder. So I had to stop a lot of times, just take it out of the machine and start again from a different angle so I didn't have to push it all through. Because if you're sewing quite a small intricate line and then trying to stuff the jacket through at the same time, that can get quite difficult and cause mistakes, which I didn't want to happen.